Well, the Independent Electoral Commission will tomorrow begin public hearings into draft regulations for the Political Party Funding Act. The two-day hearings start in Cape Town. Approximately 4,300 written submissions have already been received. For more on this, we are joined in studio by IEC's Chief Electoral Officer, Mamabolo. Always good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much.
So this is a moment that we've all been waiting for a very, very long time. Just let's sort of remind viewers how we got here.
Well, these regulations are were published for public comment following the assent of the Political Funding Act by the President early in January. And that act is a sequel to the efforts of civil society, who over an extended period of time demanded that there be a legal framework for the disclosure of public funding, to political parties. So the act was passed last year in Parliament, and the President assented to it in January this year. In March, at the beginning of March, the Commission published regulations, and those regulations, they deal with the mechanics of implementing the act. Now, Leon, in my view, this piece of legislation, it's an important component of the total architecture of the political system in the country. It's an accountability mechanism that has been introduced to ensure openness and transparency in our politics. So it's an important element of our architecture in the political system, and it will foster the strengthening of democracy if well implemented.
Yeah, so I mean that answers my next question, which is really why is this so important? And I think you've laid that out. But let's go back a little bit, because this goes back. You've given us a bit of the foundation as to how we've landed up at the position we're in. But in August 2017, the committee agreed to repeal the existence of the Public Funding of Represented Political Parties Act number 103 of 1997. Yep. So I suppose, we need to ask what the defects were or are of this 1997 Act.
The Constitution provided that an act be passed to facilitate the public funding of political parties. So the 1997 Act was a response to that constitutional provision. What that Act in 1997 did not do was to regulate private funding of political parties. So the new Act that was passed last year by Parliament introduces the regulation of the private funding to political parties. And it also creates what we call a multi-party democracy fund, onto which corporates can make contributions, which contributions the Commission must then disperse to represented political parties.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the regulations of this Political Party Funding Act is that it prohibits certain donations made directly to political parties. I mean, which donations are we referring to here?
Well, donations from proceeds of crime, those are prohibited. Donations from state enterprises, donations from constitutional bodies, donations from foreign governments or agencies of foreign governments, all those are prohibited. So they are disallowed in terms of this new act.
Yeah. I mean, if we look, we sort of have to look at ourselves in context to the rest of the world. And I mean, let's just take the US system for an example. And I mean, there is a full-scale candidates soliciting funds, and that it's done, and it is a done practice. What is the difference between our model and their model?
Well, our model is largely trying to address a situation where people buy influence through politicians or political parties. The US system has been in existence for quite a long time. They register super PACs, and those super PACs must be monitored, and they've got to make declarations to the Commission. And we are also trying to go some distance in there to ensure that every amount beyond the threshold. The threshold in our case is 100,000. Be declared so that every quarter the Commission issues a report that says Party A received so much from these entities or these persons, Party B, and so on and so on. So it is an act that will really open up the space, open up the transparency envelope, as it were, for the public.
Yeah. Let's bring it very close to home right now, because, I mean, we have the case right now. It's something that is in the headlines, in our midst, and something that's a very, very hot potato right now. And this is the Bosasa case, which is sitting, playing itself out in all courts, and our president is involved in this. Is this something that the IEC has actually looked into? And, I mean, going further than that, will this actually fall outside of the Act?
Look, the present Act does not explicitly deal with the issue of financing of campaigns for internal party contests. And that's something that has got to be looked at for the future. Obviously, as the Commission, we are circumscribed by what is within the four corners of the statute book. And for the future, it's something that perhaps must be looked at quite closely by Parliament. And when amended, then it will fall within the scope of the Act.
Okay, all right. So that would fall within the scope of the Act, which makes it even more interesting. And this, I imagine, is there to assist in avoiding such cases happening in the future again.
Certainly. We, to the extent that there has not been a regulatory framework, has meant that all manner of possibilities were happening in terms of where people source funding and so on. And one cannot, therefore, absent a framework, impute blame on people. You've got to create certainty by setting up a regulatory framework and ensure that there is a compliance framework as well as an enforcement framework for that regulatory system. So
obviously it's not law now. There are still the public hearings that have to be held, and then it will then be a process and come into law in, I suppose, not the too distant future. What happens then? Is that the time where parties then have to declare their political funders?
Yes, we will hear over the next 2 days, the 1st and 2nd of August, oral submissions. We have to take those oral submissions into account in finalizing the regulations. And once the regulations are finalized, there will have to be a commencement notice that is issued that says, from this date, any donations that a party receives must be declared on a quarterly basis, and this is the mechanism of doing it.
From this date, i.e. when that comes into law. So whatever's happened beforehand, it doesn't matter.
Well, there's a principle in our legal system that the law apply retrospectively. Rather prospectively, and not retrospectively.
Yeah, okay. Does the Act go as far as actually providing penalties for offenders? Indeed,
there's a Schedule 1 to the Act does give administrative fines as well as jail terms for people who transgress certain provisions of the Act.
Right. Well, public hearings are taking place. Tomorrow will be the first day. This should be an interesting one. Mamabolo talking to us about these IEC public hearings into the draft regulations for the Political Party Funding Act. That's Act 6 of 2018, taking place in Cape Town tomorrow and on Friday. Thanks very much, Sai.
Thank you,
It's always a pleasure chatting to you.
Sure.
The time now is 8 o'clock.